Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Lin. I'm Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the Roski School of Art and Design, and I am thrilled to welcome you today to our penultimate Roski Talk of the semester. I'm joined here by curator and scholar Anu Vikram, who is teaching our related graduate student seminar and who will lead the Q&A following the talk this afternoon. We are so super thrilled today to be hearing from the brilliant scholar, art historian, queer feminist theorist, and curator extraordinaire, our very own Professor Amelia Jones, who is the Robert A. Day Professor of Art and Design, Vice Dean of Academics and Research, and Chair of Critical Studies here in USC's Roski School of Art and Design. And we are super excited to hear about her exhibition that opened recently, Queer Communion, Raw and Athey, now up at Participant Inc. in New York City for a few more days. Yes, Amelia? And it will be coming soon also here to Los Angeles at the ICA. Our graduate student, Austin, is going to introduce her in just a moment, but I wanted to also take this moment to remind you not to miss our final Roski talk, which will be delivered by artist and professor and head of graduate studies in art at UC Irvine, Simon Liang, and he will be speaking on April 21st at 2 p.m. So you can register for that and find more information about any other upcoming Roski events by visiting roski.usc.edu/events. All right, so without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Austin Villacis. Yes? Yes. Austin Villacis, the MA student in Roski's graduate program in curatorial studies and the public sphere, who is going to introduce our honored speaker today. Thank you, Austin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. So as Jenny said, Amelia Jones is the Robert A. Day Professor and Vice Dean of Academics and Research here at Roski. As a feminist curator and a theorist and historian of art and performance, some of her recent publications include Seeing Differently, A History and Theory of Identification in the Visual Arts in 2012, Perform, Repeat, Record, Live, Art and History in 2012, co-edited with Adrian Heathfield, the edited volume Sexuality in 2014, and co-edited with Aaron Silver, Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories in 2016. Amelia is the curator of the critically acclaimed exhibition Sexual Politics, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party in Feminist Art History at the Hammer Museum, and organized the exhibition Material Traces, Time and Gesture in Contemporary Art at the Leonard and Bina Allen Gallery in 2013. Recently, she curated a retrospective of the work of Ron Athey, currently on view at Participant in NYC through April 4th, accompanied by the catalog Queer Communion, Ron Athey, which has been listed among the New York Times Best Art Books of 2020. And she also published In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance in 2020, where she presents her new research examining 60 years of theory and practice around queer and the performative. And with that, I will hand it over to Amelia.
Thank you so much. I'm actually kind of more nervous talking to my own institution and students than I usually am. So, but also really excited because I've been teasing everyone around me for years about this project. So thank you, everyone. And I'm just going to share my screen and then I will get going. Does this look good, Anna? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this show, Queer Communion, Ron Athey, which has taken many, many years to come to fruition. So I want to look at it in relation to two major issues. To give an overview of the exhibition, just to give a taste of it before it arrives here in Los Angeles, and also obviously some people on this Zoom are from elsewhere. I know some people are here from Europe, which is really exciting. So it may be traveling to the UK as well. So to give a little taste of it for everyone. And then second, I want to talk about, or to use the opportunity of talking about the show in order to pose some bigger questions about curating live art or the careers and work of performance artists, and the question of curating queer shows, like what is it that we mean by that? So the question of curating live or performance art is something that I've been working on for many years, very interesting kind of philosophical questions that become very direct and very technical when you're actually organizing a show. So it's one thing to kind of write essays or write a book about what does it mean to historicize live art or performance art. It's another thing entirely to actually have to organize objects and videos and relics of various kinds in space to create a good experience for the visitor. So the question is kind of how to keep the work alive, like how to give some kind of sense of what it would have meant to see the work when it was presented live, how to frame it so as to tell a story that provides the work with texture and a historical framework, but while avoiding a kind of instrumentalization, trying not to put the framework before the work. So those two things kind of have to go together to produce, I think, the most exciting experience for the visitor. And finally, how to provide a lively aesthetic experience without evacuating the fierce politics of the performances, which is especially pointed and key with Ron Athey's work. Then there are the questions of, what is queer curating? What is a queer show or exhibition? This can mean many different things. It can mean curating art or archives determined to be queer, and or by artists that we understand as being queer. Or it can mean curating through methods driven by a queer politics. So if we mean by queer curating art or archives determined to be queer, or by artists seen as queer, a subset of this might be the question, well, what do we mean by queer work? What is a queer exhibition? What do we mean by a queer artist? Martin Manalasan has written about the messiness of queer archives. So that might be like a subset of that question, that queer lives are often lives that are less supported, and therefore the archives might be more personal, which was absolutely the case with Ron Athey. There is a tendency in the art world to conflate queer as a political concept tied to a theory of denaturalizing heteronormative frameworks with people one perceives as lesbian, gay, bi, or trans. So if we're curating a show of work by an artist that people assume to be gay or lesbian, does that make the show queer? I would argue not necessarily. Curating by methods driven by queer politics, this I took as a really, really important, if not driving question. What does it mean to curate in a queer way? Or as Jose Munoz suggests, what does it mean to do queerness? And as someone who's kind of hovered on the edges of queer communities for a long time, that was something I felt was extremely important for me to try to explore and honor. I wanted to produce an experience for queers to feel embraced and energized, but also for non-queer identified people to engage with aspects of queer experience in a way that made it exciting and interesting. I hope to have honored Athey's queer identification as a gay man while also foregrounding queer community as a key source of political energy, powering what I think of as queer survivance. And I think with the pandemic, we've really come to an acute sense of an awareness, those of us who aren't so precarious, of what it means to be precarious. We've become more aware, seeing that with our students and with people across the country. And so I've thought more and more about Ron's queer community in terms of the precarity of many of these people. And that's something I didn't want to gloss over with the kind of spectacular nature of the work. I wanted that to be somehow in the show. So then the questions become, what are the ideas behind the show? How did I come to frame it in the way that I do? And I really basically just asked myself over a period of years, why am I drawn to this work? What is it about it that I find so powerful and valuable? So I'll give a little bit of a nutshell history of how I came to Ron's work. I first saw the piece that is advertised in this flyer, part of the torture trilogy called Deliverance, at 18th Street Arts Complex in Santa Monica in 1994. I was basically brought there by my good friends, Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan, who said, oh, we have this friend, Ron, you have to see this work. I was really not ready for the kind of BDSM experience, even though I knew Ron and Sherry's work and was kind of intrigued by it. I had then known of his work at this time, and I watched this performance and I was incredibly impressed, but also emotionally not really ready to take it on. By the early 2000s, I had moved to England and started to re-engage Ron's work, especially in 2004, at which point I flew to Ljubljana in Slovenia to see a festival organized by Ron and Vaginal Davis, the apotheosis of which was this premiere of Ron Athey and Juliana Snapper in Judas Cradle. Now, just before that, when I had moved to England in 2003, my personal life had kind of imploded. So my fairly normative nuclear family had blown up in my face. I was abandoned with 2 children. And I tell that story because when I went to see Judas Cradle, all of a sudden it made perfect sense to me. So it was a kind of emotional state of readiness to understand the kinds of extreme bodily suffering that Ron was portraying in the performance that kind of clicked with me at the time. So I felt the eviscerating elements of my own life allowed me to connect directly to Ron's willingness to kind of narrate a woundedness in a lot of the work. I wrote at the time a very revealing short essay about my relationship to his work in Judas Cradle in relation to what I call my holes in TDR, which is very out there. When I read it today, I kind of like, oh my God. So if anyone's interested, I can send you that article. And at the time, I was also starting to socialize more with Ron and with Vaginal Davis. And so like being in Ljubljana with them was a really also just embracing experience of queer community. Ron had actually moved to the UK like myself. In his case, he'd moved there in 2009 and left in 2015. So we actually overlapped there as well as we had in LA. So I saw quite a bit of him and traveled around the UK seeing various performances. So that's all a preface for saying that when I started thinking about doing a show, something clicked in terms of queer community, and it became clear to me in my head that this was really the best way to organize the show, because it's about Ron's work, but it's also about queer community. Very recently, just this month actually, Athey, in answer to Hans Ulrich Obrist, who was describing Athey's friendship with Kembra Fowler and gender experimentation in the 90s, Ron answered, we were just doing our thing and creating a bit of family around that, which is kind of crystallizes this casualness of queer community, but also obviously Ron's work became very uncasual and extremely elaborate and theatrical. So he he kind of built on that out of the 1990s. So for me, it was very personal, this being drawn very directly to Ron's work. Although I'd known him for many years and I'd known his work, I hadn't really connected to it until this early 2000s. I had a feeling that I belonged, or maybe not, but that even if I didn't belong, it was okay, that I could hang out with these people, that they were non-judgmental, that there was generosity, and there was like a kind of deep supportiveness that I hadn't been used to in the mainstream art world. This community offered awareness that my feeling of being torn to shreds was a human feeling that Ron and other queers not only shared, but in Ron's case, was willing to perform publicly. The reason I ultimately chose the title Queer Communion was that I felt this kind of beautifully encapsulated both the community, but also through the word communion, the ritual and religious elements that Ron himself persistently draws from in the work. So that a kind of a double project there. In this recent interview, Hans-Ulrich Obrist asks Ron about queer communion in relation to the title of the show. And Ron answers, wouldn't it be better to help develop a scene that you would want to live in or you would want to learn from? There's an often repeated and not quite true thing that I formed a new religion after leaving religion. And I'm lucky I have Nietzsche for that. I mean, and he does read Nietzsche. So, like, yes, I do something, but I don't want to just be alone in doing it. So you have to find the reason why you do it and nurture people around you. I think of generosity in terms of interaction with people. It's hard for me to use that word within the work itself because I don't know another way to approach how I work. So I love that because I feel that as well, that he distinguishes between his kind of social generosity and the work, which has a rigor and specificity that's not necessarily solely aimed at generously embracing every possible kind of person. In fact, it's not really that kind of work. It's very specific, it's very challenging. So that's kind of the first part of how I came to that concept. As I said, there was a lot of debate, and I was very interested in this question of how do you historicize or curate live art? I co-edited this book with Adrian Heathfield called Perform, Repeat, Record, Live Art and History. I did an art journal segment that Ron actually contributed to about documentation. And so I was really interested in how different performance artists were navigating this issue. How did they document their work? How did they think about their work as it entered into the historical record? Around 2010, I left Manchester for a job at McGill University in Montreal. And that's when I really started thinking about doing this show. So kind of, how would I do it? What would I do? I felt like Ron was not really, he's extremely well known in performance art, but not really known except as a peripheral figure within the mainstream art world. And I took this as a challenge not to absorb his work into the mainstream, but what would it mean to put his work more in that framework as an irritant to the mainstream, which for those of you who know my work, I'm always trying to do. So instead of demeaning Ron's work, it was more about like, how do I challenge art history? How do I challenge the museum to deal with this kind of complex performance practice? So I started thinking about the show. I contributed an essay to Dominic Johnson's book, Pleading in the Blood, The Art and Performances of Ron Athey. I'll talk about that more in a minute. By 2014, I had moved back to LA to take the job at USC. And suddenly the whole project accelerated because Ron moved back a year later and started, about after a year, he was threatened with eviction from his rent-controlled apartment, which is, again, a perfect example of the kind of precarity that is really not just haunting queer communities and the art world, but actually dogging it and threatening to destroy it. So he posted at one point in Facebook that he was going to just throw all his entire archive out onto the street and have a giant bonfire because he was so understandably so angry about this precarity and not being, you know, more appreciated by the art world. But I think by like that we just don't live in a society that actually sees the arts as something worth supporting as a society. So my partner, Paul Donald, and I went racing, well, after making arrangements with Ron, obviously, we went racing over with a truck and helped pick up all of these, you can see very jumbled props and archives and boxes of materials in 2016, agreeing to store them at our house because I was already thinking of this show. So I was in a very weird position then of literally living with all these materials that I was curating into a show, which I wouldn't recommend as a general idea. It's pretty exhausting. But then I worked with a number of archives to find one that wanted to acquire the materials. And what you don't see here is boxes and boxes of drawings and photographs and paper objects. This was not difficult, actually. There were a number of archives that were interested, and Ron settled on the Getty, and John Tain and Glenn Phillips facilitated this acquisition. So I was then in the position in the fall of 2017, I had about 6 weeks to basically curate the entire show, like long before it was actually going to take place, because the Getty was coming to pick everything up. And I knew I had to pull everything out for the show because you couldn't, the Getty doesn't generally loan large parts of archives. The Getty was great. They were amenable. They said, as long as you keep it, you know, straight, and so it will eventually be absorbed into the Getty archive. The more difficult part really was I spent years trying to get venues to do the show. So finding a place to acquire the archive was not hard, but finding venues, and that points to exactly this discrepancy between the existing art world, which claims to be radical and yet just can't even contemplate how you would do a show of a career of a performance artist, but especially a BDSM queer performance artist. The ice kind of broke finally when I stopped talking to, you know, mainstream venues and went to Leah Gonchitano, who is a hero. She is my hero. She has been a hero to the queer community for years. She's the director of Participant Inc. and was extremely supportive, totally non-hesitant, embraced the show entirely, and really deserves a lot of credit for making it happen. And then the ICA was kind of in transition as I was looking for venues. So by the time Participant agreed, then the ICA was super willing, and I'm working with Jamila James there, and it will open in June. So just briefly, I did also, because it's so much easier for me to write books than it is to curate shows. So I whipped together this giant catalog with the help, the absolutely indispensable help of Andy Campbell, my colleague at Roski, who I just knew was like the perfect person to bring into this project, because Andy, in fact, is the expert on queer archives. And so he brought like a really smart way of thinking about what does it mean to do like a catalog of a show that has this kind of archival bent. And yeah, it was just fantastic working with Andy. And very early on, we decided that it made a lot of sense trying to get Intellect Press to do the book as kind of a companion to this book I mentioned earlier, which is a more art historical take on Ron Athey's career, with a lot of very beautiful photographs and production values, and much more taxonomical, because Dominic is very good at like keeping straight all the different people and the different permutations of different performances. So thank God someone had already done that. So the catalog is a very different kind of book that in fact focuses, I'll show you the back before I get to the table of contents. And actually briefly, the picture on the back cover was what I wanted to be on the cover because I think it's hilarious. It's actually Ron's terrible handwriting, kind of obviously ironically commenting on his around 19 or 20-year-old face with the beginnings of his tattoos as all American. But Ron didn't want the book to be, signaled as an archival book. He wanted a major artwork. So we put this fantastic image of a cephalous monster on the cover. But he was okay with me sneaking this onto the back. So what is the book is, in a way, I think it's not just a companion to the show. I really think it's of equal importance in that it's, in a sense, its own version of an exhibition in a book format. So it has the usual kind of prelude by Andy and myself. It has my introduction where I go into some of the details I'm talking about here. And then it has a very large section, which I wish you could see, but on Zoom you probably can't, of different paper stock. So at least a third of the book is Ron Athey's writings. And I thought that was really important to include some like very important and influential published writings, including columns that he wrote for Honcho, a famous article he wrote for the LA Weekly, but also a number of unpublished writings from the archive, which include everything from like really self-revealing diary entries to sketches for pieces, and some kind of drafts of things that became performances later. So that's a really beautiful part of the book. There's then a section called Reflections, which are longer but not super long essays by authors, mostly not academic, although a few of them are more historical and academic. Some of the authors know Athey, some study queer culture, art, and performance. Then there's a section that was really important to me called Object Lessons, where particular objects from the archive we asked people like Amber Musser and Jennifer Doyle and Alpesh Patel. And Andy actually wrote one of the most amazing essays on 2 fisting photographs that we found in the archive, nestled into an offering envelope from the Pentecostal church, which seemed ripe for Andy obsessing over. I wrote my object lesson on a leather studded codpiece, which I'll show you in a moment. So they were kind of things that we thought people would obsess over, and people really had fun with that. And that to me, again, is not just a supplement to the show, but it's actually a way of articulating what the archive and the performance career is about. And then the last part of the book is a general checklist, which could not really be specific because I still didn't really know. I hadn't done the layout of the participant or the ICA, so I didn't know exactly what was going to be in there. But I could organize it according to this logic, which I knew I wanted the show to have. So because of the idea of queer community, queer communion, the show was going to be organized according to the various communities that Ron Athey has helped to form and or circulated within throughout his life. And that was my mobilizing concept. And I actually had more categories at one point, but I had to pare it down when I knew the participant was going to be the first venue because it's a fairly small space. And in the end, as often happens when we're forced to cut something down, we kind of realize, oh, it's actually better with fewer categories. So it really makes sense. These categories are organized in what I call a recursive chronology, in the sense that religion and family is the first section that you see when you walk in. And of course, that does kind of roughly begin at the beginning of Ron's life in 1961, because his family is his family. And it's roughly recursively chronological in the sense that it moves through his career, but each of the areas really overlaps. So I think that'll be clear as I go through what I mean by that. So if you start with the religion and family section, to your left, you see what is on the bottom right here, which is a brand new rendition of a piece called Joyce, which was this kind of huge proscenium type performance where there were live performers on the top, as you see in this document on the left. And there were videos, 3 large screen projected videos on the bottom. And that's Ron with his mother, Joyce. So this piece, Joyce, which you would see coming into the show as these 3 monitors, which are the same footage that you would have seen at the bottom of the actual installed performance work. And then in the monitor on the floor there, you would be seeing an overall view that would look more like this image on the left. So it's complicated, but the idea was to evoke this very complex performance, which was not seen by very many people, was performed only in Europe. And to open the show with that, which Ron worked with this video artist, Wiz, Glenn Fogel, to pull this footage together. And it's really exciting because, again, it's a recursive chronology. So it's about Ron's mother and his family life, but it was made in 2002. So, you know, it's not a strict chronology. It's evocative of these periods of his life and these communities. And then across from that there are some vitrines. So there's a vitrine with a number of documents. There are 2 costumes from the Joyce performance, one of which, the one on the wall, Ron helped organize and decide how that would be displayed. That's why it looks so fabulous. And then on the left, you see the hair washing piece for Mary Magdalene, which brings up his background, being raised as a Pentecostalist in a very fundamentalist family who believed that he would be the next great Pentecostalist minister. And of course, that's not at all incidental to his career, not only in terms of the content of his work, which often evokes this kind of imagery, but also in terms of his charisma and his performativity as a person. So in that vitrine, you see his LA Weekly cover piece on Miss Velma, this figure, this charismatic preacher from LA. You see flyers from various services at Miss Velma and Dr. Jagger's Universal World Church. So this is all part of Ron's kind of youth, but also moving into the 1990s, where he was still interested in Miss Velma. And actually, if you look on the upper left there, you see a letter that she wrote to Ron in response when he sent her a copy of the LA Weekly story, which she seemed to enjoy. So there's some fun archival elements. There's a few pictures from his childhood. So again, you get this kind of move between this historical past, but also how he pulls these elements into the present, into all of his work. The second section is music and clubs. So by the time Ron was a teenager, he left home, probably for obvious reasons, as coming out as a queer person. He wasn't finding it sympathetic to be in this fundamentalist household. And he very early on met up with Roz Williams, whom you see in these pictures with Ron on the upper right, and got involved with the kind of punk music scene going on actually in Pomona, believe it or not, for those of you from Southern California, and in Los Angeles. So Ron grew up in Pomona, and by this time was mostly spending time in LA, but he and Roz Williams performed in their group Premature Ejaculation in Pomona, which is hard to believe, but amazing. So there are flyers again. And curatorially, you know, I was trying really hard again to create an exciting experience for visitors, whether or not they were familiar with these communities and this work. So part of that has to do with like not just having a bunch of vitrines, right? So vitrines are great, but you don't want to just have vitrines. You want to have a kind of varied experience that brings to life kind of the embodiment and the excitement of these various parts and communities in Ron's career. So there are these flyers from their performances. There are photographs of Ron trying on various like punk guises at the time. And then very quickly turns from kind of the early 80s to the late 80s, early 90s, because the 80s were mostly a period of recovery for Ron as he was trying to figure out how to survive, basically, and had been heavily involved in drugs and was finding a way out of that. So there's kind of an interesting time gap there. But by the late 80s, early 90s, you find him very actively performing, and there's the famous leather-studded codpiece, wonderful photographs by Sherry Rose, photographs of Club Fuck, which was an LA kind of underground queer club. And I'm really excited by this curatorial choice that I wanted to blow up some of the basically just snapshots. So the Sherry Rose picture is just a snapshot, but because it's an analog photograph, it blew up really beautifully to this large life-sized image of Ron. And then on the left, you can see that I, with the advice of Hannah Grossman, who was working with me for a while on the show, decided to frame some of the kind of, they're fairly grotty, like photocopied flyers and snapshots, and some of them are stills of videos. And just to frame some of them to kind of change and vary the aesthetic experience as you walk through the show. So those are framed, and then the pièce de résistance is the cod piece on a plinth with the go-go dancing boots, which I just love those moments where you can fetishize rather than just looking at documents or vitrines. So you see a little bit more of a close-up here, the different kinds of imagery from the archive that I'm trying to bring to life. The next section is literature, tattoo, BDSM. Here I had a lot of fun, again, with texture and kind of trying to bring the experience to life. So there is a vitrine that includes a sketchbook by Ron of various kind of working towards this Trojan whore character, which he performed. On the left there, you see him with his very close friend, Lawrence Steger, who died shortly after from complications of AIDS. So that's very present throughout the show as well. And kind of sketch ideas for the Trojan War and Saint Sebastian. And again, my insistence was the rubber sex doll mouth had to be on a plinth with these jeweled pins. So you see that on the left in the overall picture. Ron also was a columnist for Honcho, so I included one of his columns. Again, these are just close-up images of the Trojan Whore where you see the various different versions of it. This is Ron actually encased in this like layered and layered and layered kind of feminine but encased bound object as the Trojan Whore. And you can see that in process in some of the images. So the BDSM elements aren't just kind of thrown out there, they're all contextualized in relation to particular performances. So you see how he kind of works towards these ideas of the bound figure on the left. This is him in the middle as a nurse in drag with his mouth sewn shut. And then also the images he kind of drew from art history of Saint Sebastian, this gay icon, where he himself actually performs as Saint Sebastian and has himself pierced. And so all of it has a context in this section so that I hope it makes sense for people of varying different communities. This full-size Polaroid is not in the show, but it's just here to kind of illustrate one version of where the Trojan Whore kind of turns into the hatchet pussy figure that then appears in Solar Anus with the Solar Anus crown. So the other aspect that's being evoked in this section is Ron's erudition and deep study, self-taught study of especially French modernism, anything from Bataille to Genet to the work of Pierre Molinier, this BDSM photographer who photographed himself in these extreme positions as kind of self-fetishized. And you can really see the connection with Ron's works, especially the performance of Solar Anus. And then you can also see a progression towards more and more ambitious, theatrical, and just visually stunning versions of the performances. So by the time you get to the late 90s, you can see that Ron is hiring very professional photographers and documentarians, and the imagery suddenly gets much more beautiful and lavish and artful in that sense. So yeah, and then I might come back to Gifts of the Spirit, but I wanted to show as you transition into the art performance politics, there's a kind of segue from the more artful versions of the BDSM imagery into the art performance politics. So, you know, but again, they're all overlapping. So it's a way of trying to narrate a vague kind of transition without demarcating it too strictly. Because in fact, from the early 90s through the early 2000s, Ron was becoming more and more ambitious with his staging. And as I said, more concerned with the documentation. So there you see the two images on the left from Solar Anus. And then in the middle, you see the works from Gifts of the Spirit. This very lavish, extremely theatrical operatic version where he worked with Sean Griffin of Opera Povera and did this kind of apotheosis version of Gifts of the Spirit in Los Angeles in 2018. This is a project that he's been working on for decades as a autobiography, actually. So there's also some texts in the catalog where he writes through this idea of Gifts of the Spirit through autobiographical stream of consciousness kind of writing. And by the 2000s, he started to translate this into this large-scale performance, which involved him speaking in tongues and participants doing automatic writing. And so that's the work that reaches its apotheosis in 2018. And that this progression kind of marks that move towards the more and more theatrical and grand scale works, among which is also Judas Cradle, a work he did between 2004, 2005 with Juliana Snapper, who's an opera singer. So one of the things Ron is incredibly good at is kind of having an ambition that he actualizes by working with these highly trained musicians and singers. But more importantly, as you transition into the art performance politics section, is this tiny little video of Jesse Helms. I've basically spent the last 30 years of my career waiting for the moment where I could diminish Jesse Helms into a tiny little screen. And he has to face the performance that he denigrated on the floor of the Congress in 1994. This is him pointing at Ron. And he was basically jumping on a bandwagon, dumping on the performance of Four Scenes and a Harsh Life, which was done in 1994, but he of course never saw the performance. So I was very keen to set this up so that little tiny Jesse had to be confronted with Ron and his troupe performing Four Scenes and a Harsh Life throughout the entire run of the show. So the monitor across from Jesse Helms is this kind of period 1990s monitor with this low quality VHS documentation, because then of course Ron wasn't really thinking about documentation very much. But that's in between these two extremely lush, beautiful performance kind of setup photographs. The one on the left is by Kathy Opie, the one on the right is by Sinclair. Also, just below Jesse Helms is a vitrine with press from the so-called Culture Wars scandal, where my favorite is the cartoon on the right, where someone has depicted a kind of Newt Gingrich, Jesse Helms person who is performing part of Four Scenes and a Harsh Life as a way of taking a dig at their right-wing politics. At the end of the room, which you see kind of as you walk in the gallery, are these extraordinary costumes, which I really give full credit to Ron here for making sure they were displayed in a very theatrical way. So he worked with Hermes Patakos to bring this cast head and hands, and really brought this costume on the right is one that he wore in the performance Deliverance, which I mentioned before. And the costume on the left is actually a Lee Bowery costume that was given to Ron by Lee Bowery's partner when he died. And Ron then has worn it in various photographs and in performances. So this is a very kind of grand, contemplative moment in an otherwise pretty busy show. Finally, the very back room of participant is the new work and community. So there's a beaded curtain that has appeared in many different performances of Ron's. Most recently, as you saw in that grand scale version of Gifts of the Spirit, there was a larger version of a beaded curtain. On the right is a cast of Ron and the Louis XVI wig from his piece Acephalous Monster. And then there are props on the left, as well as we had to do an iPad scrolling through Ron's friends because we couldn't have a photo album because of COVID. So just coming towards an ending here, I would throw out, one of the really interesting things you learn about the problem of the archive very quickly when you're looking at an artist of Ron's age is that, there were lots of analog photographs up until about 2002, 2003, and then 0. So you can really feel the transfer over to the digital when you no longer have things to hold in your hands to put in a show. So what I did was I assiduously basically haunted or cruised Ron's social media. And every day I would take screenshots of things he was posting of himself and his friends so that I could keep the friends updated on this scrolling kind of slideshow. So it has a lot of things from social media, but also a lot of scanned photographs from the earlier part of his career. At the ICA, I'm hoping to include more things that I had to leave out, such as these gifts from friends, which are pretty crazy. There's a Kathy Opie jar with a pierced hand that I can't wait to put somewhere. There's a wonderful card, Happy Father's Day, I love you, Dad, from Zachary Drucker that I really love. So I think that would be a fun way to sum up that community. So, I mean, I'll end there just with some, like, this is what happens when you curate a show with a live artist, as he shows up with suitcases of extra props. And as a curator, you panic, but then you realize, oh, this is kind of cool. And you work with the artist and you figure it out. So Ron was super active in displaying the props and how to put the costumes in particular on display. And then because of COVID, we had an all-day opening where people like Kembra Fowler showed up in person. And of course, they're also in the community slideshow. So that was kind of fun. And, you know, now you bring these things to life, obviously, through social media as well. And finally, coming to an end is the magnificent performance that Ron organized with the gallery 2 days after the opening, where you see the inside on the right, which is basically a production shot that the audience saw only the image that was live projected through the front door of the gallery. It was really beautiful. And it was a very interesting way to handle the COVID issue because anyone could be out on the street watching this. It was also live streamed on the website. And it was totally live edited by Glenn Fogel, like while it was going on. So it was really pretty exciting. So I will stop there. If I can oh, weird. Wait a second, I've lost the stop share for some reason. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Amelia. That was amazing. So fascinating. So we have a couple questions in the chat, but I want to start by asking you a little bit more about the question you raised of queer curating as a methodology, and being a methodology that one can apply to artists who identify as queer or artists who don't. Tell me more about how it deviates, or tell us all more about how it deviates from art historical versions of archiving or traditional object curating, in your view?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Maybe I should think about that and write an article, because I think it was kind of instinctive. It was like trying to kind of circulate within this queer performance community, which I've been kind of circulating in and out of since the 90s, because I've known lots of these people for a long time. It's like a lived thing. And then immersing in the archive, it's even more instinctive. It's just like, I just could feel that I was never going to curate the show like an art historian would do, in the sense of like breaking it down into categories, although there are kind of loose categories, but they were really, I wanted them to be evocative of this lived experience of these communities, not like an art historical taxonomy. So I was, you know, I hope that that works. It seems that people are really enjoying it. Also notice that I didn't say this, but there's no wall text at all other than those general titles, which I deliberately had placed very high on the wall so that you can engage with them and kind of think, oh, what is that? Or you could just enjoy the stuff. But obviously I'm still kind of an art historian, so there's a really long detailed checklist that you can access through a QR code, or there's a few hard copies. So like anyone who's nerdy enough and wants to know, every single object is labeled, everything in a vitrine, everything on the wall. So it's all there if you want to know, but I didn't feel it was necessary for everybody to know all that stuff. Like in a way, I felt it was more important to get like the energy of this work and of Ron and of this community, or the different energies really, because each different setting is a really different thing.
And can you explain for us what the value is for Ron's career longevity and our ability to remember his work, that you've done all that art historical work, that you've made those checklists and those inventories and placed those archives and stored these objects? Just, I think we have a number of particularly, students who may not be familiar with these practices and why they're so important.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking that too, because I think rightly so, some people view the show as just Ron's work. And I think that's great. And I wanted them to be able to do that. But I think that the historical and curatorial work is really essential to honoring Ron's work. That if you just put all of his performances, like here's a document of this performance, or even if you put all the really cool props, if you had no context for them, you would totally miss all of these complicated things that Ron has been doing across this career. You would also miss all of these bigger picture issues. You would miss the culture wars. You would miss, which I didn't want to spend too much time on, frankly, because his work in this country has been way too kind of subordinated to that. But you would miss this like punk scene that was actually, some people have argued recently that LA punk kind of lasted longer than in New York and London because, as Ron says, nobody cared. That's why it lasted so long. And there's something that I absolutely love about LA and could talk about all day.
Well, that's good, because that's the next question, actually, Amelia. So somebody was asking if you could say more, not only about LA punk, but specifically about Pomona and the kind of the punk scene that's more regional, because, we do sort of dismiss culturally those parts of the LA metro, but actually when it came to punk, they were very important and groundbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, so LA is like, maybe Pomona is part of the LA psyche, maybe, depending on who you ask. But for those of you who don't know Southern California, it is a city east of LA that is very working class. Well, it was very working class, pretty white, although Ron really went to very mixed schools. But it was very poor. It was not wealthy people at all. Now it's quite different. But so it was a kind of seething hotbed of disaffected, fairly disenfranchised young people, some of whom were white, some of whom were not. And that, breeds this kind of anarchic culture in a time in US history where young people were really chafing at the, over the top American values that were being shoved down our throats. I was just teaching this today in my class, and I pointed out that all these 20-year-olds in my class should really learn about this period, because there's a strong parallel with young people today feeling really angry and disaffected by the claims of Americanness that leaves out so many people. So yeah, I think it's really all these different parts of an urban area become, in their different ways, sites for these things to happen. I actually want to ask Ron more about why premature ejaculation was taking place in that Pomona particular site. I think he said it was a, God, what did he say? See, he tells me so many things and I don't remember all of them, but it was space that was run by a friend, and so they would bring in friends, and it was all part of a community.
And they were both members were from Pomona.
Yes, I think he met Roz in Pomona, but he was also starting to circulate very much in LA and was very jazzed by people like Johanna Wendt. It's a huge influence, who was doing really raucous, amazing performances. So yeah, from the moment I came to LA, I first moved here in '87. I never thought it was provincial or boring in any way. Like, I could see from the very beginning, even the stuff that was happening as I was there. It was so exciting. And it was partly that feeling that no one anywhere else cared. So nothing was getting institutionalized. There was no art market here. There was there was a music industry, obviously, but they didn't care about LA punk. It didn't even register. So you had Alice Bagg, and you had like all these incredible people and they were doing it out of compulsion. I think the way Ron talks about his early emergence was just like, well, I just had to do it. It just was what I was doing. It wasn't like he had some idea he wanted to be an artist and had to figure it out.
Then the next question is about how to protect our valuable queer artists from becoming political footballs, perhaps, and to give them support when we find that the more well-resourced institutions aren't ready to open their doors. As you described, going to an institution like Participant, which is a much smaller budget size, even the ICA is a smaller museum, they're not collecting institutions, and they don't have a provision to accept the props and the objects.
No.
So can you talk about how we as curators and scholars and as audiences can help support the longevity of the artists themselves? You also spoke about Ron's relative lack of wealth, and the way in which his practice hasn't necessarily always kept him, say, in his apartment. So yeah, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I should say first, I neglected to point out that the Getty would not take the props. So the Getty's only taking the paper archive, which is heartbreaking to me, but so we'll see what happens with that. But Ron is extremely enterprising. And so, as he's pointed out in this Hans Ulrich Obrist interview recently, he's producing yet another new performance, which again is a curator's nightmare. It's like, oh no, more new work. But in order to finance it, he just had a GoFundMe campaign and started selling catalogs and t-shirts. So he's got a pretty strong political position on that, which is don't wait for the art world to do something for you. And actually, I think that's really good advice, not just for artists, but for all young people, is don't wait for, Google to do something for you. Don't wait for grownups to do something for you. Don't wait for the United States to do something for you. Like, figure out how to do the stuff you want to do by infiltrating the systems and using them. And so, but Ron and I have very different positions. I actually didn't think the Getty was the best place for his archive, because I come out of art history, which venerates institutions like the Getty, and I'm very suspicious of them because I gravitated over to performance studies for a reason. From Ron's point of view, he just wants his stuff considered to be art. So, obviously it was his choice. So, I had to kind of step back and think, oh, yeah, I kind of get that. But from his point of view, the Getty supports artists by at least they're able to pay to acquire archives. So that's something not a lot of archives are able to do. So that's like a way that also he's very savvy in making that choice. How do we as curators? One of the questions is, honestly, curators are not supported either working on this kind of work. And I know, Joseph Valencia is here. I know he knows what I'm talking about. So it's like one thing to get the one gay and lesbian archive to do your show on queer Chicano art nightlife. it's another thing to actually make a living and be taken seriously as a curator and be supported by institutions that have more money. Not going to happen. So I happen to have a full-time job and I'm doing this show, which is kind of how I roll, but it's not easy. But like, yeah, curators are not supported either. And it's all part of the same picture. And it, you know, I'm not like, again, I have a different position from Ron because I don't think the answer is for Ron Athey to be in the Museum of Modern Art. Like, to me, that would just, that's like the wrong thing, because MoMA would ruin whatever is resistant about Ron's work, because that's what MoMA does. You know what I mean? But it's easy for me to say that because I have a full-time job. So it's really complicated. And I think it just, again, I think infiltration would be my best take home on that, is infiltrate, find the institutions where you can do it. They're not going to be able to pay you very much. It's going to be really hard, but lower your expectations. The one thing we can all do, and I'm really telling young people this, is don't buy into needing to have, you know, a lavish lifestyle. But at the same time, it's easy for me to say because I have health insurance, you know. These things are really tricky, and I think we need to change everything, but that's another talk.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Hong Zhang, for that question. The last question we have two more. So Andy was wondering if you could talk about your book In Between Subjects in the context of queer communion. What are the correspondences between the projects, and what are, if any, plans for performance during the LA run of the Athey Show?
Thank you, Andy. I get to talk about my other book. Yeah, so all along while I was imagining this show, I was also formulating this book, which became In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, which in a way is like really different and doesn't really, it's not the same thing at all, even though weirdly they're both about queer performance. And I do include some of Ron's book in that. I mean, some of Ron's work in the book, but it's really a very big picture look at why is it that these terms queer and performance or queer and performativity started to come kind of glued together in the 90s, so that they've become kind of, it's become this kind of self-evident assumption, so that RuPaul's Drag Race, you know, seems like a natural thing, that you have men performing in drag, and that's queer and it's performative. And you even have a character on RuPaul's Drag Race using Judith Butler as a kind of trope. Like, so Judith Butler is the, you know, extremely abstruse theoretician of queer performance. So that's what that book is, really kind of, what is this? Why are we making this assumption? I think, like, even though I do talk about Ron's work in the book, I think his work is something different, to the degree that it's, I don't think anyone would dispute that Ron's work is queer performance. But a lot of the stuff I talk about in Between Subjects is actually just work that circulates more broadly around this idea of queer performativity, like RuPaul's Drag Race, or, you know, certain practices that aren't as ensconced in like performance worlds as queer performance. So they're complementary, I would say, but and they're directly related in that I do talk about Ron's work, but indirectly, I think, in the bigger sense.
Thank you. And then Susan Silton, hi Susan, has a question. Thank you for this wonderful overview of the exhibition. Could you talk a bit more about queer survivance? And the grad students wanted to hear about this too. So you mentioned in your essay for the Queer Communion book that you are interested in this idea of survivance, and that it comes from Indigenous theory, but you see a way to apply it in a queer context. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah, I need to research it before I really speak more specifically because it's like an idea. So the idea of queer survival and queer precarity is something I've thought about extensively. But this term survivance, which I believe was also Roland Barthes used the term, so it does have a queer historical connection. From the little that I've gleaned of the term, it's really interesting in that it kind of makes survival into like a project, and it becomes your project whether you like it or not if you're from certain communities. And of course, that's extremely different between indigeneity or being indigenous versus being a queer gay man, white gay man living in LA. They're very, very different. So I would want to be very careful exploring what that means in the indigenous case in relation to what it means for someone like Ron. But because I've never really immersed this deeply in a single artist's like methods and way of surviving, even though I did a show of Judy Chicago, but she pretty quickly figured out how to, well, actually, she also had to cobble together ways of surviving, and then now is, taken seriously and all. But yeah, it interests me, this question of marginality, which I've always focused on artists who are not put at the centers. And it interests me partly because of this bigger picture question of, okay, so you're an artist and you're not going to be paid a lot for it or heralded within these existing structures that support you financially. So what are you going to do? And I've always been drawn to the artists who kind of figure that out. And they figure it out by all these different means, and it often involves infiltrating and reworking systems, which I think in the long run can have a really radical, really interesting, much more structurally profound effect on the art world than someone who's just trying to put themselves into the Museum of Modern Art with generally, gay iconography. I'm just, that probably doesn't even exist, but Judith Rodenbeck said, I just saw her put in the chat, survivance is living beyond Jesse Helms, keep making work that pushes the boundary, including the boundaries of queer normcore. Absolutely. And actually, Ron had to leave the United States because of that, because of the culture wars. He wasn't getting any commissions, institutions were distancing themselves because of, Jesse Helms and his ilk. So it has I didn't even mention that, but it's it has really profound consequences when you are hounded by a right-wing senator. It's not just an inconvenience, but it means that
plague.
You're surviving under a plague and you're being, well, that's partly how Jesse Helms calls him out. Of course, he calls forth the specter of AIDS and AIDS blood. So it's all connected. And so for Ron, that's the reason he ended up moving to the UK, was he just wasn't getting interest in his work or support for his work.
Thank you. So the last question we have is from Madison, who says, thank you for the super generative presentation. And they are asking whether there is a boundary in sharing queer work. So I think this is a little bit about the border between communion and archiving or historical praxis, which is, what do you reveal and what do you hold back, if anything, from the material that is personal?
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. Thank you, Madison. Yeah, Ron was until he started bringing props, as he would, it makes perfect sense. He was very laid back and not really, he was extremely generous and very hands off. And Andy and I had to get him to sit down with us to go over some of the writings, because Andy and I kind of wanted to publish them, but some of them we weren't sure because we were like, this is really personal. Are you sure you? And most of it he was okay with. I mean, I think he really is an exhibitionist in the best sense of the word. Like, he's not worried about some secret information, obviously, if you look at his work. So that was great. But then there were documents that I didn't even ask him about that I made the decision not to, even consider for inclusion in the catalog, in particular in the writing section, because I think for me, it's about treading a line between what is like really interesting in like giving you a textured sense of where someone's coming from, and then what crosses the line into, oh no, this is like people are going to obsess over this piece of information and it's going to distract them from the work. So for me, like, this is an artist. Like, I'm not writing a biography. I'm trying to give people access to his work in a particular way. And so the decisions were about, like, what would just make people obsess over that thing rather than, getting kind of insight into Ron's thought process or where he was coming from. Or, for example, that period in the 80s where he was in recovery, there's some writings from when he was in AA and kind of writing it out. And, he was okay with including those. And they're super interesting because they really resonate with the performances. Like, you can see he's getting some of that ability to write through things from that process. So that's kind of how we made the decision. And there were certain things, for example, even today, I thought, oh, I should show the fantastic fisting images that Andy writes about. And I thought, no, because then it's possible that like all the Q&A will be about that. And I wanted to just like verbally describe it. Yeah, so you make decisions not because I'm like, prissy. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing the show, but because there's a context where you could show that and no one would bat an eye, but a Roski talk is probably not that context. So,
yeah, I'm interested in how you turn up the volume and down the volume on the shock value aspect of things as you're describing, which I think dovetails with Suzanne's comment. It's a good place to close, which is that you've worked with two artists who've attacked by right-wing politicians, Judy Chicago and Ron Athey. And she mentions a video of an attack on the floor of the House, which is, I think, the one that you showed, the home studio, right? So I think that is an interesting thing to consider as well, that each object in itself has a certain power, including a certain power to shock. But you don't want to make a show that sort of slaps people in the face with shock after shock. So
because exactly, that would be the absolute wrong thing to do, because in both cases, I'm loath to talk about intentionality, and I wring the necks of my students when they revert to that. But I spent a lot of time with Judy Chicago and with Ron Athey, and I know for a fact that they're not planning to shock people. This is not why they're doing this work. So yeah, that's a great question curatorially, but also historically. Like, how do you write about this work? And I couldn't not represent that moment, but I wanted to minimize the way in which Jesse Helms distorted everything Ron was doing towards his own prurient, dirty, disgusting ends. By saying that Ron was doing that, it was really, and Ron actually loves that clip because it's really true. I urge everyone to go on C-SPAN and watch it, because Jesse Helms is a performer. And Ron's saying, like, he's almost like, it's kind of gay. And he's obviously like super attached to this photograph of this beautiful man. And he even says he's a beautiful man. So, but then you don't want that to be the focus. You want to pass by that and make a point that it is somewhat of a turning point in the career, because obviously Ron had to respond to that situation, but it's not formative for Ron's work any more than Judy Chicago's work, which was also called out on the floor of the US Congress, which is kind of hilarious if you compare how anodyne it is, relative to BDSM performance. But, the right wing can turn anything into a horrifying specter of the decadence of American culture and values.
It gives you an excuse to do more weird queer things, I think.
Absolutely.
And you can be as free and unafraid as Ron to have your dirty laundry aired in public.
Yeah, he's very fearless because he doesn't depend on the system at all. And I think that's what's saved him from what's happened to a lot of queer artists, often after their deaths because of the AIDS crisis, being incorporated into the art market. And it's, I mean, maybe it will happen, but it'll happen in a different way from, say, Felix Gonzalez Torres.
That's a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Amelia. This has been a fantastic talk. Such a pleasure to hear from you. And we can't wait to see the show when it opens in June.
Me too. I think Ron's bringing more suitcases with more props.
Of course, he's going to come in and change it every day, isn't he?
Yeah, we'll see. It'll be great.
Fantastic. So we are going to take 5 bio break, and then we'll come back and reconvene at the other link for the VAST seminar, where the grad students can't wait to talk to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
And have a wonderful week, and happy Trans Day of Visibility, everybody. Bye.